Thanks, Felice, and thanks to all of you for coming. I guess I can start off talking a little bit about Stonewall 50, in that I think what was really important for me thinking about this really momentous anniversary and thinking about how we might celebrate it is thinking about how to celebrate it in a way that wasn't nostalgic, a way that respected that history, but dwelled firmly in the present and really had a mind to looking towards the future and what was happening. I think for those of you who may not be familiar with Stonewall Riots, on July 28th in 1969, the police raided, and these were a serial series of raids, a bar called the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village in New York City. The bar's patrons revolted and took to the streets. Things escalated, and it turned into a multi-day and then multi-week riot that really became the genesis of the modern LGBTQ civil rights and movement. Thinking about that and thinking about the kind of political stakes today was something that was really important for me, but of course times have changed. And so the ways that I tried to kind of think about going through the show and putting things together, we're thinking about a few different strands that somehow I feel like weave together over the course of the exhibition. One is trans visibility, which I think is a very important issue for the community right now. Another is creating opportunities for intergenerational dialogue, so including elder artists and younger artists whose works are very much in conversation with one another. And in some cases, it shows us how little has changed over that history and how there's still so much more to be fought for. And then the third was to look outside of the United States, to look at artists who are creating in other areas and to think about the reverberations that this riot that happened 50 years ago in New York might have for the lives of queer folks in other countries and other places. I think that we can do this kind of informally. I'll talk a little bit about some of the video works that are in here, and I'll let everybody kind of go in and just experience them on their own time. And I'll talk generally about some of the things that are around us, and then we'll move down that way. But as people have questions, feel free to kind of ask them, while we're touring around. In this room in the back, what you'll see is what I've always thought of as a kind of show within a show. The artist is Barbara Hammer. Hammer was a pioneering experimental lesbian filmmaker. She died recently, just a few weeks ago, and it was a real honor to be able to work with her over the course of the past year to plan this installation. The first films that Barbara made were made in the 70s, and we have work from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and we also have her most recent video installation, which was completed in 2018, a piece that was commissioned by the Wexner Center in Columbus, Ohio. It's called Evidentiary Bodies. It's a video installation that very much is Barbara thinking about her own mortality in the face of the cancer that she was suffering through. But you'll see when you look at her work that there are lots of ways that Barbara is thinking about the body in other ways. So certainly Evidentiary Bodies is thinking about the body's health, well-being, but she's also thinking about layers, kind of interior layers, the psychology of things, the way that psychology and surfaces of bodies interact. She's very, very much a tactile filmmaker. You'll see in the earlier works like Psychosynthesis, another film called Sanctus, that she's layering other films, hand coloring, hand tinting, reversing things, really playing with the negatives in order to kind of play with the image and think about trying to get you to see multiple things at once. One of the other things that I think is maybe a nice introduction to Barbara's work is a piece outside from 1983 called Audience. And for that work, it really shows Barbara as the kind of really pioneering figure that she is in the early 80s, the first, that's terrible. The first of her screenings happened, the first retrospective screenings happened. And what she did was she showed up at the screenings with a video camera and basically interviewed people who were waiting in line to get into the screenings, asking them what they think they'd saw, why they were showing up, why they really were interested in her work. And it's really interesting. You get a sense, it's of course a lot of people talking about how important it is to see representations of themselves in the world. That for me was really exciting. And then she follows that up by meeting with groups of people after the screenings. That happens in a few cities, in Montreal, another one in London, etc. And you hear people kind of talking about their responses to her work. And so in that way, it's a kind of nice introduction and maybe a way to get into the work. I guess one of the concerns that I had in putting this show together is also thinking about those strands and the way that those strands would link together. I don't think that there's any one narrative that really could draw together a very vast history and a kind of creation that ultimately is extremely diverse. And so what became exciting to me was to look at the ways in which unexpected things kind of start to link with each other. So over here on the far wall behind us, you see paintings by Christina Quarles, an artist who's based in Los Angeles. Paul Mpagi Sapuya over here. And what's interesting for me, thinking about the ways that they're both looking at the body and at abstraction, while Christina is doing it through the painting, and I'd encourage everybody to kind of get up close and see, these are painted on raw canvas. There's a lot of really interesting work. She's using stenciling, staining the canvas, and really kind of creating these hybrid bodies that are not really portraits in any specific sense, but suggest kind of ways that the body might change, might morph, might interact with other bodies, or indeed, like with this image on the far left, with other objects. In Paul's work, I think there's a different form of abstraction that happens. Paul is using things like other prints, like mirrors, to reflect back the camera. You see this kind of evidence of a studio practice. The studio is a place where Paul started out doing more traditional portraits, and his practice has morphed over time. So in an image like this one, you see his hands kind of coming in from the side, holding a slice of a print up. And it's interesting for me to kind of think about the ways in which that idea of looking at what's real, what's the print, or in images like these, where you see mirrors reflecting, sometimes the camera being reflected in the mirror, sometimes other bodies being reflected in that same mirror. You see evidence of fingerprints on the mirrors, things like that, that really start to make a kind of a very layered collage. And collage is also one of the elements that, for me, really starts to unite lots of works in the exhibition. Behind us, another painter, this Chitra Ganesh. And Ganesh's work was a commissioned work for the exhibition. It's a piece called Cadre. It came out of Chitra thinking about this idea of the protester as a real central figure for queer histories. And so Chitra created these portraits of larger-than-life, certainly, figures who really have the kind of spirit for her of protest in them. So one, a kind of figure that, looks like she holds the space with a fence or a face that looks like it's made out of chain link fence, rope to hold things away, other elements that have been collaged into the a bit menacing, and then other figures like the mermaid that appears over on the side, Or the central figure doing a backbend is an Egyptian goddess called Nut, who basically was said to hold the kind of celestial body underneath the arc of her back. As we kind of swing over and look this way, these portraits that you see are by Zanele Muholi, who is from Johannesburg in South Africa. These combine two series of works that she's been doing for a number of years. One body of them is called Faces and Phases. Those are portraits of queer identified individuals in South Africa. The others are from a series that are called Brave Beauties. The Brave Beauties are portraits of drag queens and trans individuals. For me, it's really important that these are individuals kind of coming out and showing up to get their portraits taken, identifying themselves as part of an extended queer community. And also, what's interesting about Zanele's practice, each of the sitters gets a portrait for themselves, and then it shows this kind of the extent of the group. Of course, we're showing just a very small portion of the, many hundreds of portraits that she's taken over the years that she's been shooting this. It's also interesting because you do have some individuals who have been photographed a number of times over the years, and so you also get an understanding of the arc of the ways that kind of people and who fall off because they've passed away, moved on, etc. And again, over on this side, another set of photographs by Paul Mpagi Sipuya. These, I think the one on the left is particularly interesting to me. It feels a bit like an old master painting. A really incredible sense of still life that's happening. I call it more a still life than a portrait, even though what's really in there and kind of couched under the black velvet that's in that image are some bodies. And really kind of quite a special work to take a very close look at. As we swing around, works by Tony Fair. Tony also recently passed, a really great sculptor. Many of you may have seen the large exhibition that Tony did a short time ago, a retrospective at the Blaffer Museum at University of Houston. It was really special to be around and kind of have time to see that. Tony is also somebody who's part of Extended Family of Mine. And it's sad to see him go, but really incredible to get to feature work. I think one of the things that you'll see that's so special about Tony's work is that he's taking very kind of simple, almost trash materials and kind of really figuring out ways to repurpose them, to give them a kind of sense of a very unique beauty. The works that you see here, inside-out potato chip bags that have been punched with holes, creating this kind of starburst. It also, for me, feels a bit like a mask, quite special. And then the objects that are in this piece are things you would pick up off of the ground, taking walks around the East Village, the neighborhood where he lived. Collect them up, put them away in jars for thinking about eventually using them, and then started to just do very simple things like just set up these kind of groups of objects in small constellations. In a very similar way, the works that you see on both sides of this console here are by Tommy Lanigan Schmidt. Tommy is another person who's very simple materials. In this case, these are collages that incorporate tinfoil, photographs that have been cut out of older magazines, a lot of cellophane, a lot of glitter, pipe cleaners, plastic flowers, silk flowers, newspaper clippings, really kind of quite simple, quite basic materials, and really trying to imbue them or successfully I would say, imbuing them with a real sense of magic and life. You get a sense also of some of the interests. I think that, there are a series of self-portraits here. These, I will also say, are made in 1968-69. At the time, Tommy was hanging out in New York, was involved with a lot of the folks who were at the Stonewall Inn, spent quite a bit of time there himself. And it's interesting to see somebody who, ultimately we really understand that at the point that he was making these, he's not somebody who had the finances, the kind of ability to go out and buy materials. And so he's using really simple materials and repurposing them in a really quite magical way. As we swing around, I think one of the things that probably is most special in the exhibition is that I had the great opportunity through Nick Vaughn and Jake Margolin, who I ask you to kind of also spend some time looking at their video installation, Political Gestures, which is just on the other side of this wall. I was introduced when we were kind of doing studio visits and talking about political gestures. We were talking about how in the queer community, bars are a real place where a lot of organizing happens. Certainly things like Stonewall, but also things like when one thinks about the onset of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, that really bars, and in particular places like Mary's, naturally, here in Houston, were places where the community came together to say, okay, if nobody else is going to protect us, we need to start by protecting ourselves and looking out for our brothers and sisters. So what ended up happening through that conversation is that I was introduced by Nick and Jake to Judy Reeves, who is with the Gulf Coast Gay and Lesbian Archives. The folks there had actually gone into Mary's, which operated at the corner of Westheimer and Waugh, which now some of you may know as Blacksmith Coffee. It operated from 1971 to 2009. There was a period then at the end where it would kind of open and close a little bit. But when the space, it looked like, was essentially going to be demolished inside, these folks went in and took out this bar top. The bar top, we figured out, was made around 1985. Patrons of the bar, and some of you may actually know this history a little bit better than I have, were invited to come in and contribute images. The images are, of course, lots of celebration, but I think there were also probably just as many folks who thought of it as a memorial to folks from the community who had been lost. It's interesting for me then, what they did was they covered it all with resin, and so it really becomes a kind of time capsule. And you can see the way that the community is represented, both things like you see some images of concerts from what I'm imagining are gay men's choruses, the Houston Motorcycle Club, different events that people were dressed up. A really great image of a dog here who's doing drag as a lion. You get a sense that this was a really celebratory place. And it felt really important for me to kind of link to a very specific history from here to show that these are the kinds of things that were happening not only at bars like Stonewall, but certainly at Mary's. There's also some interesting stories that about the police raids that were happening at Mary's during some earlier Pride celebrations, that the police would go in the week before Pride and basically raid the bar. It started to be kind of such a popular event that people would show up just to take part in these raids and get arrested to kind of make a political statement. And then I even heard last night about a point at which some folks went and raided a police bar and took out all their tables and chairs and bar stools and said to the police, it's not just the police that can raid a bar. So sometimes the tables get turned. I think also we can look at these things. In these cases, you see a set of books by David Lejeune. David's books have, for me, a really interesting relation with her in terms of thinking about these aspects of collage. David has been making these books for quite a few decades. I think I probably looked through about 40 different books. As you can imagine, as you're paging through them, each book is just full of collage and real treasures. They are a bit raunchy and celebratory in that. But I think what's also interesting is to kind of find ways in. And so in this first case, you see one of the very early books that David made when he was spending some time in New York City. And you see the evolution of the collage that basically starts out like sketchbooks with notations, almost in a diaristic way. And then those diary notations kind of open up for more collaged elements, square images cut out from other places. Then it starts to be a bit more intricate in terms of the ways that images are fitted together. And by the end, and certainly currently, it's a lot of really exquisite small cut work that's being pasted and collaged together to create really quite fantastic images. The kind of bar situation continues around here. And so it is fun for me that also the entrance into political gestures gets to happen through the bar. You get a sense of what that space is. For this, Nick and Jake worked with a group of performers from Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Am I saying? And basically, these are performers that might normally be out, lip syncing to other kinds of songs, also doing their own kind of political organizing. What they actually do is Nick and Jake chose a series of political speeches that have been delivered over multiple years. One, for instance, is Sylvia Rivera talking about at one of the Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade rallies, one of the original Pride parades in 1973. She excoriates the crowd that had kind of gathered and saying, look, you're not thinking about your black and brown brothers and sisters. You're not thinking about your poor brothers and sisters. You're not thinking about incarcerated brothers and sisters. And unless we kind of look at everybody and kind of give everybody the same rights, we're not all going to rise. We need to get together to rise. And certainly that's the spirit for me of political gestures, is thinking about both the ways that this kind of protest can be celebratory as well as defiant. And for me, it's that mixture, I think, of celebration and defiance that marks quite a few of the works in this exhibition. That things that are kind of marginal, like Tony Fayer's sculptures that are made out of essentially detritus, are things that are imbued with a real kind of spirit and a real sense of specialness through a great degree of care. The work in the central part of the gallery here is by Jean-Michel Othoniel, an artist who is based in Paris. It's called Yellow Brick Road. Certainly a reference to the Yellow Brick Road from The Wizard of Oz. In a kind of a side way, it's also a reference to the queer icon Judy Garland. There are some folks that say that the Stonewall Riots, earlier in that same week, Judy Garland passed away, and that people were so distraught that they were kind of driven to riot. I would actually say that that's a kind of a bit of gilding the lily and kind of having fun making up a pretty fabulous story. Ultimately, we really can understand that these were a group of individuals who were frustrated by their serial persecution. But in the same way that there is this beauty of this object, the reflective surface. This is glass. They're blown into molds. It's an amber glass that has silver blown inside of it. So in the same way that this is a kind of beautiful gilded object, it also, there's another side of it, you know, when we think about the idea of kind of, as the Stonewall Riots were said to have started, picking up and throwing a brick through a window. So there are both sides of that history. On this far wall, you see works by Troy Mitchie. Again, another situation in which these are things, both the kind of the bar top are really great to get in and kind of explore more closely, as are these woven collages by Mitchie. One of the things that I think has been also really incredibly special for me in thinking about the exhibition are thinking about all of the kind of various textures that are happening. That certainly happens in these collages. Troy is taking images that are taken out of porn, mostly bodies of black and brown men. But what he's doing is kind of subverting the images by controlling and censoring in a certain way the images so that the body, hiding portions of the body though, it does this thing where it actually creates a bit more kind of frisson and a bit more imagination. So the body also, it appears that it could be kind of peeled back and revealed to kind of work on it, thinking about those images and where they might have come from. In another similar way, Troy is also a person who very much comes out of a painting background. The paintings, however, have always had a kind of very sculptural quality. I think it is definitely something for me to kind of think about these as kind of queer paintings in the way that they're non-conforming. They are often kind of being very sculptural. They often are you know, incorporating things like this one has a cut-up shoe, these work gloves, and also images that are coming from other places. Again, thinking about the ways that many of the artists in this exhibition are collaging images together. In another way, I think Leila Bibirye's works are also a conversation around collage with a very different kind of physicality, where Troy's works have a very refined sense to them. What I think is really special about Leila's work is the kind of roughness and the spirit that's in all of these. And again, we're looking at objects, many of which have been, you know, recuperated from being trash, and also really kind of identifying a way that things are like paintings. The speed of these, I feel like even though they present themselves as though they're paintings, they're also equally sculptures. They also feel to me very much like drawings in the way that they feel kind of put together quite quickly, although I'm sure that also they're quite thought out in that same way. These sculptural busts that you see in the front, it was also really interesting for me to think about. Leila is somebody who's been kind of creating this work for some time. We're actually also very, very happy to have her here with us for the opening. And Leila, I think if I can kind of ask you some questions, one of the things that is kind of particularly interesting for me is thinking about the kind of history that you have with materials. And I wonder if you don't mind to kind of talk about how you started making work in Uganda.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to show at very important occasion of Stonewall. I have a background of where I come from. It's really hard to tell people that being gay is real and it exists. And to me, it is a very great pleasure to find myself in a celebration of Stonewall at 50. I have a background of being an activist, both political and gay rights in Uganda. And that is how I started triggering off from my sculpture carving classes. Because let me hope I'm not nervous. Let me do it. And my background is basically, when I went to school, it was about carving, and it was about carving human figures, being inspired by all these famous sculptors, the Henry Moore, the Barbara Hepworth. It's like, school thing, reading, just carving and just duplicating. It's carving. But at a certain point, around 2010, I go back after my undergraduate. I go back to the same university. I wanted to do my graduate. And then I felt this is the time when I felt like I can't stand in the closet anymore. It's the time when the Parliament of Uganda had passed the anti-homosexuality bill, and they wanted to, they're now tabling it and wanted to pass it as a law. And the only way, we had already talked, we were all over the place protesting, but it wasn't working. People were, my friends were doing everything they could. But as an artist, I'm like, how can I throw this out on an academia table? And the only way was coming back to my master's and change my thesis from something else, and then now looking at the gay rights through my art. I really wanted to show the beauty. Actually, what I wanted to show by then was I wanted to define the different sexual orientation through the art. And I remember my professors asking me, define for us what is LGBTI. So I started defining the term, and everybody was leaving the room. And I'm like, but I think I have a point. They're like, okay, why don't you look, if you really want to look at women, you're interested in women, why don't you do eroticism? Look at women in a naked way. That is academia. I'm like, no, I'm on a point where I feel like this is what I want to talk about, and it's political. And being now it was illegal, nobody would stand to mark me. And then I ended up not doing my master's, and I was so frustrated. When I went back home, I started burning my work. I felt like it wasn't, I was so frustrated. And that is how I now get off from the modeling technique of, the traditional carving of wood and modeling and doing cement and all that. Just got all my works and then started burning them. And one of my lecturers, who is also a friend, she came in at my home one day and told me, do you really want to fight burning your work? You're killing yourself. And if you really want us to understand you, and you want the community around to understand you, I think the best way is to educate them, but not fight back. And I'm like, how am I fighting back? I'm not fighting back to you guys. So she told me, when you pollute the environment, while you're doing it to feel relieved as an artist, but at the end of the day, you don't care about people around you. You're evaporating the place. So if you're toxinating the whole area, that means you're harming everybody around you, and they don't know why you're doing it. It's because of frustration. Then the best way is, why don't you teach people the fact that, yes, we're good people? And the context of the rubbish now, I started reading back and asking myself, why do they call us rubbish? And we have a term in Uganda. Yeah, there is a term in Uganda where I come from, and it's called basiazi. And basiazi is when somebody calls you musiazi, it's like homosexual in English. And it's derived from the sugarcane husks. Because after eating the sugarcane, the husk has no any other value. Not even insects can eat it. So that is how terrible it is. So when I started looking at the husks, I'm like, but there's a lot of things that can be done in the rubbish. We are not rubbish. So I started using this rubbish and trash around, and now I started creating art, and which also started becoming important even to my community around my area. I've made a lot of documentaries, like photographs around my home area, whereby I would ask the teenagers or young kids to bring in trash, and then I would pay for it. And I would also teach them to, work with trash, recycling, and then that is how I kind of started working with foam material.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I think, again, it's that situation that I think is so important of thinking about the recuperation of things, thinking about how the work that you're doing is very much a kind of political work. It is also very much about visibility. It's very much about taking something that is deemed kind of culturally invaluable and really finding a way to change that narrative, to kind of really, make these objects more important. And I feel really to imbue them with a spirit of real defiance and of celebration. And so it's really, we're really happy to be able to include your work in this exhibition.
Thank you.
As we kind of swing around, the last few works that you'll see, again, another work here by Tony Fayer. It's called Ransom, made of small broken pieces of glass. Again, another conversation thinking about these kind of objects that might be recuperated. A really interesting way, say, to kind of look at also these cast-off objects or found objects through other forms. With Troy and Layla and Tony there. As we come down, I think a kind of counterpoint to Zanele Muholi's photographs are these images by Kathy Opie. Kathy is a photographer based in Los Angeles, and she's really probably most well known for taking images of folks in her community, these kind of portraits. Among them, the model Jenny Shimuzu, artist Harry Dodge, J.D. Sampson, Eileen Miles, the poet. These are all people that are kind of part of Kathy's extended community. And again, these issues of the community kind of picturing itself for other people are things that happen over and over in the exhibition. These ideas of kind of being able to control our own representations and to really celebrate certainly kind of gender non-conforming positions. It's definitely a part of Kathy's work. And I thought that it was also a kind of really special thing to be able to install them in a kind of rainbow array. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, black, and white. And then finally, as we get down this way, ceramic works by Tony Sonnenberg. I think, again, these kind of issues that are coming up in the exhibition, thinking about issues of taste, thinking about issues of aesthetics, thinking about the ways that one might both kind of go with those and also might challenge them. These are primarily porcelain works. Tony has a very inventive process, unlike anything that I've seen, where he's dipping things like silk flowers, or you'll see in these kind of tchotchkes that have been kind of bought at, thrift stores or given to him by other individuals. They're coated in layers and layers of porcelain, fired, and then glazed again and fired to kind of set everything. That sense of kind of delicacy in these and of the kind of massiveness of them is something that I think is really challenging about this work. There's a sense both that it's very extremely modern and also kind of quite Baroque. And Tony, maybe can we put you on the spot too?
Sure.
So I think one of the things that might be interesting for us to talk about is a little bit the kind of theatrics of the work. Certainly that's really apparent in a piece like this tragedy vase, which is a small vase that's built for one flower to expire on stage. But I wonder if you might be able to kind of talk a little bit about the kind of drama and theatrics that the work has, and also about some of the things that are underneath that.
Well, I always kind of think of myself as, like, when I was in art school, I thought this aesthetic that I was so compelled to do was kind of this rebellious act. And so then I got really kind of interested in, like, the power of beauty and the power of a certain aesthetic. And I think when thinking about myself and a queer artist and how I was going to address that, I'm from a small town where everything is camped in several layers. So I think there was something about putting these layers in here, but also having this immense amount of history, both in their art history terms and also the tchotchkes of the personal history. So yeah, so I think just thinking about histories and thinking about times and collapsing those times, and I think one of the things that I was really interested about theatrics was not only as the way that we as individuals perform on stages, but also in the ways that theater kind of collapses and both makes you aware of time. And so when I was thinking about that and thinking about still lifes and thinking about memento moris and all those kind of things, I thought there was something about having, art history versus your grandmother's history versus the history of this flower and its tragic story happening, like, right now. And then something about ceramics that's both, Andy Warhol has this quote where he says, beauty and danger becomes more beautiful. And so I think ceramics really plays into that, and that they're both beautiful but fragile, which in a way translates to kind of danger. And I think there's something about that with the queer experience, so maybe there's a connection there too.
Definitely. Excellent. Thank you. So do folks have any questions about?
Okay.
Yes.
So then the bar itself is like, as a structure, doesn't exist at all anymore?
The very exterior structure of the bar was retained. It's now a coffee shop inside. But there are really interesting things. Like I've heard lots of stories from folks, like during the kind of early days of the AIDS epidemic, when people were dying, there were urns that were buried in the backyard of the bar. So certainly that kind of spirit, in a way, I imagine is still there in some sense. And it definitely exists for many people, that sense of community that's still there, that bonds people together, that celebrated together in that same space. But before the space was kind of basically would have been destroyed inside, Judy, maybe can we put you on the spot to talk a little bit about this?
The bar interior was going to be destroyed, and the bar took up about 3/4 of the bar space, the inside space. So to do a coffee shop in there just wouldn't have worked. So originally we were going to go in and cut them carefully and so on and so forth, but the owner, by the time he got the property in his hands, he just ripped them apart and put them outside and left them there for me to pick up. And they were out there for several weeks before we actually went and picked them up, so they were pretty nasty. But he did save them. And it was not a real friendly thing because TABC came in and closed the bar, and the community was up in arms. I'm surprised they weren't throwing shoes at police cars. But, it was really not a pretty situation. So we were lucky to get the bars, and we got a few other knickknacks out of the bar before it was just gutted. And the back was another problem because there were a lot of plants and urns and coffee cans and just ashes buried in plastic bags and stuff out there for a lot of people. But we finally, came to grips with that. The bars were real important to save. The community kind of settled down when they found out they were gone, and we kind of kept them in hiding to make sure they survived. And I'm really proud to have them in this exhibition because this is the first time they've seen the light of day in over 10 years. You asked about the...
I was also asking if the mural, the Mary's mural, that was still up. It's been a couple of years.
Yeah, no, because Scotty Swollen came in and he painted them directly on the wall, and then he just painted over them for the next one. And he's still actually working. He has a website. He still does commissioned work. He's kind of retired. He does beautiful work, but he doesn't do any more. actually, I can talk about something else, yeah. The Eagle Bar over off of Taft. And those who know the addresses are gone, okay. 611, thank you, Hyde Park. Eagle Bar has a mural that Scotty recently did depicting Mary's in their upstairs party room. So he's still very much around, and he may be trying to get into town to see this exhibit. So
And
I've
you
been talking to him.
re-editioned a T-shirt with
Yes,
the drawing that.
and I'm not wearing it, but yes, we are selling a T-shirt downstairs in the gift shop that is a depiction of one of Scotty's pieces of art, that the angel that was in the backyard of the bar. He did, it was a T-shirt. Yeah, he did a T-shirt on Stonewall's 25th anniversary, and we redesigned that for this to sell as a commemorative thing, and he's very proud of that. So thanks for asking about Scotty.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Yes. Sorry, David Lejeune.
Those are my collages, but I just wanted to add something that's kind of ironic, which is I've always been very resistant to putting my work out in public. And when I first started making those collages and they really started getting dense, I thought, oh good, these are so outrageous, nobody will ever want to do anything with them. So just goes to show you never can tell. You know, but if you just follow your, I guess, obsessions, yeah, thank you, Dean.
Excellent. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for coming.